Welcome to the Ethical Carnivore panel. Thank you so much for being with us here today on a Sunday morning, getting up for us. Very exciting. I'm Marie Kudnek-Carlisle, as Joanne said, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Goldfinger, a social enterprise that designs and makes high-end sustainable furniture in London. And today we are going to be speaking about a lot of very, very interesting things around sustainability and food and regenerative agriculture. But before we begin, I would like to ask you all a few questions to get us started. How many of you eat meat, by a show of hands? Great. And how many of you are vegetarian or vegan? And how many of you have heard that methane from livestock farming contributes more higher carbon footprint than the transportation industry? All right, thank you very much for that. So I think here's the conundrum that most of us find ourselves in. We all eat, we all have to eat, and we all don't necessarily know what the best thing to do is to be this part of the solution for climate change. There's so much confusion, there's so many facts being thrown at us, and it's hard to know where the truth is. And it seems also really hard to talk about the subject without being accused of fanning the flames of a looming culture war. So today we have a very impressive panel of speakers to help us untangle these questions, which are undoubtedly the key issues in farming and food at the moment. And so join me in welcoming our panelists. We have John Lynch, an environmental scientist from Oxford University. We have Anna Beams over here, an environmental systems thinker working directly with farmers here in East Anglia. And Hugh Somerleyton, who is a farmer, rewilding advocate, and the founder of Wild East, and Louise Gray, who is the author of The Ethical Carnivore, where we get the title for our panel, an environmental journalist coming at this issue from the consumer's point of view, from a very personal and philosophical point of view around the issue of eating meat. And you'll be finding out a lot more about this. So we have an hour in total. We've got a lot to cover. It's a very wide subject here. So I'll be moderating the discussion, and I'll be asking the speakers to be concise so that we can hear all points of view. So here we go. So John, you heard from one of my introductory questions that pretty much everyone in the room has heard that livestock farming contributes more high carbon footprint than the transportation industry. Help us out here. From all your years of research, what is the truth? What is the relative contribution of livestock farming to the environment?
Well, I'll summarize quickly to say direct livestock emissions have caused about a fifth to a quarter of the current global temperature increase. So it's indisputable that livestock farming has had and continues to have a footprint on the climate. But we really have to dig into the details to understand that and see how we can find a sustainable route forward, because as we've seen, almost everyone in this room eats meat, and I don't think we're going to solve anything by just saying everyone needs to go vegan immediately or else. That's just not going to happen. And I actually worry that if we overemphasize the role of agriculture and livestock on the climate, then we're actually going to have kickback against wider climate action where it's even more essential. Mm-hmm. So why does agriculture and livestock contribute to global warming? So it's essentially comes down to two issues. It's agricultural greenhouse gas emissions and land use. So on the agricultural greenhouse gas emissions side, the big culprits, as I'm sure we're all used to being flagged up, are ruminant livestock. So cows and sheep and goats, any ruminants, as part of their digestive process, in their front stomach, they have this process called enteric fermentation, and they're decomposing the kind of grassy materials that we can't eat. And as a byproduct of that digestive process, they're burping out methane. So it is mainly coming out this side. With common misconception, it's out the other side. But it's because the rumination is in the front stomach. And methane is an important greenhouse gas. It's very powerful compared to carbon dioxide, but it's quite short-lived in the atmosphere, and we'll get into some of the dynamics from that shortly. So cows and sheep are burping out methane, this important greenhouse gas. Any animal manures, so from ruminants or from monogastrics, so from pigs, chickens, they're also excreting organic material, and some of the carbon in their manure is also lost as methane, so that's another source of this greenhouse gas. And then we have an even stronger greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, which is several hundred times, about 200 times stronger than carbon dioxide while it's in the atmosphere, and has an atmospheric lifetime of about 100 years. So it doesn't have this short-lived thing that methane does. So nitrous oxide is possibly actually an even bigger long-term problem than methane. And nitrous oxide is from nitrogen sources. A portion of that nitrogen is lost as nitrous oxide. So if we're spraying fertilizers, nitrogen-based fertilizers, not all of that nitrogen is going into the plant. Some of it is lost as this strong greenhouse gas. And again, from animal manures, some of the nitrogen in their manures is lost as nitrous oxide. So we have these emission categories specifically from agriculture contributing to overall global warming. So that's the first side of it. And then the other side, as I said, is land use. So every year, about 10% of our carbon dioxide emissions come from deforestation and land use change. So it's not really an issue in the UK right now. We're not deforesting, we're actually reforesting. But we only have such a landscape denuded of forest because we deforested thousands of years ago. So even though we're not actively contributing to extra CO2 annually, we have what's often called an opportunity cost of maintaining land in an unforested state. And the idea is that if we could perform agriculture more efficiently, and one way of being more efficient is to go straight from consuming plants as humans rather than through this slightly wasteful animal phase where the animals burping out methane, pooping out some of the energy, and essentially having that conversion from plants to human consumable energy less efficiently, we might be able to decrease the overall land footprint, reforest, maybe have bioenergy. So we'd be able to use the land in a way that was more kind of carbon efficient and open it up for other purposes like rewilding, so we'll talk about later. So agriculture and livestock do contribute quite significantly to climate change, but the dominant cause is most definitely fossil fuel combustion, and there's no scientific debate on this. How you demarcate different sectors can give different figures in a quite confusing way. So if we were to ask, well, what's the annual emissions contribution from livestock versus the transport sector, then they come out pretty similar. They're both of the order of kind of 15 to 20% of annual emissions. But this obscures a whole range of complexity about what we actually need to do to meet our climate targets. So I focused on the agricultural greenhouse gas emissions because that's the context of this discussion. But in terms of overall climate change, carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels is the biggest cause. And unlike methane, and even unlike nitrous oxide, any carbon dioxide that we emit from burning fossil fuels has an essentially permanent impact. Because methane is chemically active in the atmosphere, nitrous oxide is chemically active in the atmosphere, so they're continually being removed at different rates. But carbon dioxide is not chemically active. We're taking fossil stocks that have been buried underground for tens of thousands of years, adding them to the atmospheric carbon cycle. Through the fertilization effect on natural areas, some of it is taken up through woodlands and so on, some of it is absorbed into the sea, but these are finite processes. Once the natural forest community, for example, has adjusted to that higher CO2 concentration, that's it. The forest is going to cap out as the trees reach their maximum growth, and we're going to be stuck with most of the CO2 that we ever emitted. And this is why net zero is such an important principle for carbon dioxide, because only when we stop emitting more fossil carbon will we stabilize temperature, not even start bringing it down. That's simply how we stop further warming, by getting to complete net zero CO2. So that still has to be our absolute number one priority for the climate. If we don't stop burning fossil fuels, if we don't completely decarbonize, it doesn't matter what we do with agriculture, we'll still exceed any of our temperature limits. So we can't take our foot off the ball for decarbonization. Agriculture is having an impact, and we can reduce it by reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that it emits through more efficient, more sustainable farming processes. I think there will be a role for dietary change, although it's very tricky to put that in the international perspective, but it is going to be a part of it. But yeah, we can't miss our decarbonisation goal to get there as soon as possible, because we're adding this permanent stock of carbon in the atmosphere. Every year we delay complete decarbonisation of energy, and we need to do that and achieve more sustainable agriculture, but we can't do agriculture and not the CO2 side.
Thank you for that, John. Amazing. Yeah, I think you'll agree. We learned a lot from that. Thank you very much, John. Incredible amount of facts and very, very helpful. I want to pick up on talking about sustainable agriculture here and bring Anna into the conversation. We hear a lot about regenerative agriculture being the solution towards climate change and our land use. But, help us understand what is meant by regenerative agriculture.
Well, I think if you look at the actual term, the definition itself, when you look at the definition of regenerative, it means to grow from destruction. And then you put it with agriculture, which is basically to produce food and fibre. So you put the two words together, and we're looking at producing with a growth from a destructive point. And we don't need to debate that we are now living in a time of crisis. I don't want to sort of put the massive figures out to you, but I mean, you know, Britain has lost 40% of its species since 1970. In context, it's one of the greatest losses in the world. And 65% of our ecosystems are in rapid decline. And the problem with that is that once these ecosystems go into decline, they have an inability to produce for us. So this word system, which is obviously my background, I'm tasked with basically restoring resilience into damaged systems. And you can apply that across all systems, economic systems, social systems, and environmental systems. So what we're looking at is a giant system. And just without getting too conceptual, a system itself, if you were to explain it in science, is actually a figure of 8 on its side. So that's your visual of what a system looks like. And every system moves throughout this figure of 8 quite naturally. So if I give you a forest or a woodland, for example, we've all walked into a woodland where you can tell it's a mature woodland. You have the ancient trees, you have a different sort of vegetation on the floor, so you know it's a more mature woodland. But in nature, there is always something called disturbance. And it's like our own immune systems. Our own immune systems, it's quite appropriate given COVID, normally when you bash it with something, a cold or a disease of some sort, the resilience of our system has the ability to bounce back, and it's the same in a forest. So you can take disturbance as fire. So once it's reached the top curve on this figure of 8, the fire hits this woodland and it completely is destroyed on our visual, and it starts to unravel. However, this forest system remembers what it was, and it starts to regenerate after destruction. So it's retained in its memory seed banks. So it starts to renew. You get the new pioneer species, the birch and all those things, and it starts to move back up through the curve until eventually it moves back up into maturity. It can take 300 or 400 years. Every system moves throughout this cycle. Every system has disturbance to a certain degree. The problem with today's disturbance is it's not natural. It's anthropogenic. It's caused by us. And the big ones are habitat loss, pollution, alien species, and habitat fragmentation. So the disturbances are now so strong that these systems are unable to remember what they were. And they regime shift. They kick out of that figure of 8 and become another state entirely. It happened at Easter Island. It's happened all over the world. So when I bring this back into an agricultural context, as a systems thinker, our job now is to put resilience back into the systems. Now, the only way of doing that is complexity. And we have simplified all our systems. And it's the same with our gut. An oversimplified gut leads to leaky gut and all those kind of things. It's exactly the same with the environment. So we have lineated our systems to gear for a specific goal: food, money. Now, the problem with that is when the systems become so leaky, we have to then put all the components back in, which will give you context for Hugh's rewilding, where this comes from. So we know that complex systems look messy. disordered to a certain extent, which is not great on our visual. So messy farms are normally high in biodiversity. So the neater it looks, normally, the lower the biodiversity value. The same with our crops, monocultures. So it's a hard thing to explain regenerative agriculture, and in some ways I don't want to. I think this is where we're encountering problems. They're becoming sound bites off social media that people can digest. Regenerative agriculture is not so much a thing, but a goal, and the target is soil, absolutely soil, at the basis of it all. So there are principles, there are 5 core principles to regenerative agriculture. The first is don't touch the soil, which is a bit of a problem. Because any farmer will tell you that's the plough, the till, all those kind of things are inextricably linked to what they've ever known. So don't disturb the soil is number 1. Number 2 is grow a diversity of crops. So lots of different crops, more complex rotations. The third is no bare ground. And we've all seen it. It almost depicts the cultural integrity of the landscape of Suffolk when you see those amazingly ploughed fields and the evolution and the big skies, but no bare ground. It's almost like opening up our own skin and showing our organs to the air. It's not a good idea. So we want to keep that ground covered. We call them cover crops. And to keep roots in the ground of different levels, because this helps with the structural integrity of the soil itself, because Suffolk is quite a complex grade 1, grade 2 listed soil county. So we have our sandy soils, all the strip down the east coast, and they are very vulnerable to wind erosion, but they grow some of our best crops. And then we have the heavy clays, where basically if we spray a great deal, all those sprays and chemicalization basically bleed through those soils at a hell of a rate straight into our rivers and then straight into our ocean. In fact, if you look at a NASA satellite image of Britain, there's a 2-kilometer brown ring right around our island, and that is our soil. That is our number 1 natural capital in the ocean, irreversible loss. We can't bring it back. So at that point, that is serious. So regenerative agriculture is essentially, we need it. This is, and at the basis of it is soil. And as Roosevelt said, a nation that destroys its soils destroys itself. I have that sort of.
I think you've done a great job of defining it. That's fabulous. And I want to add to that just one further question for you, Anna, which is, can human agriculture survive without grazing ruminants?
That was number 5. And that is to integrate animals, graziers, back into the farm system. And I guess that's the contentious element of this. I always think of this debate about graziers. There's 2 big heavyweights. You have George Monbiot, the environmental activist and writer who probably most of us are familiar with. He advocates land sparing, which scientifically, John, you can back me here if it's right. There's a lot of scientists say it's a 50-50 debate. 50% of the land should be for nature and 50% for man. So we could end up with quite sort of polarized patches of land. So George Monbiot is vegan and absolutely against the grazing animal. And then on the other side is someone perhaps less known to the public, is a chap called Alan Savory, who is a Zimbabwean ecologist, late 80s, I think he is now. I think was a military man in the Rhodesian Wars. And after he completed the wars, he was tasked by the government to deal with elephants, the problem of elephants in Africa, which were basically coming into conflict with agricultural production and causing havoc. So they shot 400,000 elephants over 5 years, and nothing changed. In fact, the land got worse. This is desertification, where basically without a grazier, the soil moves quite fast towards what we call desertification. It's the Dust Bowls of America.
So cows are really important to restoring our
So
soil
I'm using a
health
proxy
and-
measure
yeah.
of elephants, but this is where Alan Savory, and he says it was the biggest sadness of his life. But in his failure, he accelerated towards a growth, a learning, a known. And now he is daring us to think the unthinkable, that the cow could actually save planet Earth and not destroy it. But it's not what it is, it's how we use this animal. And I think we have to distinguish between the huge grazing lots that we've seen in the US and Argentina, where they've cleared forests and these animals never see grass, and an organic local breed of cattle here. They are very distinct systems. And the grazier is absolutely essential and always has been, from the bison herds of the US prairies to the elephants in Africa to the elk in Yellowstone. Without the grazier, our ecosystems would simply unravel. So it is we need to now think the unthinkable, a radical plan
Exactly.
to challenge the norm.
Thank you, Anna, for that. Louise, I want to bring you in here because I know you have a slightly different perspective maybe on some of this, but for you, is regenerative agriculture the solution? And can you tell us a little bit more about your personal journey, very unique journey, of only eating meat that you killed yourself for a 2-year period?
Yeah, I guess I was like many members of the audience listening to all this. I felt very confused. In fact, a alternative title for my book was The Confused Carnivore, because I thought that would ring true with a lot of people. And I was working as an environmental journalist at the Daily Telegraph at the time, and I was interviewing people like John and being told, that livestock emissions is a huge contribution to climate change. So I thought to myself, well, if I really want to reduce climate change, which I do, also talking to other scientists tell me what's going to happen if we go beyond 4 degrees or even 2 degrees, then I need to become vegetarian or vegan. But I'm also a farmer's daughter. I actually grew up around here. My dad's a farmer. And I grew up around beef cattle. And I didn't have a problem with seeing animals farmed. But I wanted to really, if I was going to eat meat, I really wanted to understand the full process. And there'd be that moment, I'm sure we're all familiar with it, where you're a sort of nice middle-class dinner party, and people say, oh, yes, I know where this comes from. It says here, it's from, well, if it's Tesco, something like Nightingale Farm or whatever, I know where it comes from. And I'd look at it and think, we don't know where it came from. How was it raised and how was it killed? So if I'm going to eat meat, I'm going to only eat animals I kill myself. And I meant to do it for a year, but I ended up doing it for 2 years. And I started off with shellfish, progressed to fish, and I learned a lot about shooting and hunting. I shot wild animals. I'm not going to give away the story to tell you what happened, but I learned a lot about the culture of our landscape, actually, about how people have learnt to manage the landscape for game and for other animals, and I also looked at livestock, farmed animals. So I wasn't killing them myself, but I was tracing them all the way back through the abattoir. So sheep, pigs, cattle, and over a year I didn't eat much meat, and I learned to take it a lot more seriously as a treat. And my conclusion, I guess, at the end was, if you're going to eat, if you do kill animals yourself, you don't want to eat so much. And I also interviewed a lot of vegans. I made vegan sausages. That was part of it as well. And I was quite pro the vegan argument as well, because it does reduce your carbon footprint. But for me, I saw a lot of positives in animal agriculture and chose to eat a small amount of meat. and the story of my book was really trying to explain a lot of the science, but also to give people the confidence to make their own decisions, because you can't tell people what to eat. So in this panel, no one's going to, well, I'm sure everyone will give you their opinion, but no one's going to tell you for sure what you should be eating. And to answer Marie's question about regenerative agriculture, so then you start thinking, okay, is it okay for me to eat meat? Does it have to be from regenerative agriculture? And I think that's way too confusing for the consumer. We all have to eat less meat. We have to eat 30% less meat as a country to have a chance of meeting our target to be carbon neutral by 2050. And we have to, when we look at farming and how it's going to be done, that's a debate that's going on right now, right? And I don't think there's one answer. So I personally think regenerative agriculture could be part of it. But the reason people come to a place like Essex, to where we are now, is it's a mosaic of landscapes. Like, we like to see animals in the landscape, and we like to see farms, but we also need to eat. So we do need, I believe, we need some quite intensive farming. You could call it sustainable intensive farming, and then you need land sparing. So the land sparing relies on the land where you do farm to be very intensive. So I don't happen to agree with it. I think you can have some land spared. You can have some agroecological or regenerative. There are lots of names for it, but farming which allows for a lot of wildlife, and then you can have areas which are rewilded. There's a recent study out called the National Food Strategy, which makes that argument that you can have a mosaic, and I think that's what would suit Britain and would enable us to reduce our emissions to zero by 2050. But as an individual, I do think, like, you go through the supermarket and you're told, you're expected to understand regenerative farming. As you heard, it's quite a complex thing. Or is it agroecological? Or is it organic? Or
biodynamic?
Biodynamic? What the hell? And I think it should just be farming and food, and you should expect farming. And there's lots of farmers in the audience, actually, should expect farming to take care of the environment, and it does, and farmers do, and you're part of that debate because you eat. So I think you should just think about food and farming and consider that a complex thing you have to understand and talk about. But I don't think there are any labels that will answer our questions. So I just have tried through my personal journey to show how you can explore these issues and hopefully come to some personal resolutions.
Yeah, and there is no right answer, and it is a very personal choice.
Yeah.
Because I think with eating meat, there's a whole host of nutritional questions, environmental questions, and ethical questions, and those are all very, very personal. So thank you for that, Louise. Thank you for sharing about your journey. Before we come on to Hugh, I just want to ask Anna one little question here that pings off what Louise was just talking about, which is the UK government's new 25-year plan really signals a seismic shift in UK agricultural policy and a shifting from this CAP EU subsidy scheme to the new ELMS. Can you summarize that for us in a nutshell, Anna? What is it? How does it work? Wow. In a nutshell. You can do it.
Okay. So the question is, how did we get here? Mm-hmm. How did we get in this mess? Louise referred to the UK food strategy, which has just been published, in fact, by Henry Dimbleby. It's a very interesting document. And basically, his statement was, how do we end up with a food system that has destroyed the environment and is destroying our health? So you do think, how the hell did we get in this mess? And actually, you do have to take it back to answer the question from CAP to ELMS. And actually, it probably goes back to the Second World War, when there was a US biologist, Norman Borlaug, who basically thought very hard about how do we produce for this population. And he basically developed 4 pillars that probably define all agriculture today. And those 4 pillars were, he took a wheat yield. Wheat at the time was considered high calorific value, which is a big change to now, because now we're looking at high nutrient value food. At the time, it was high calorific value. So he took the wheat yield, and he didn't isolate it so much, as we're doing now, perhaps with GM, which is another too big a debate for today. But he looked at this yield and thought, I want to select the highest possible yield with highest calorific value. That was number 1. Number 2, he wanted to give this water at any cost. So he developed irrigation. And then number 3, he thought, I want to sort of power boost this ear of corn with nutrients. So along came the nitrates, the fertilization. At any cost, this thing was going to survive. And then finally, he wanted to remove all threat to this ear of corn. So those brought the pesticides, the insecticides, the fungicides, the DDT, which actually, those were the original chemicals for warfare. And so the chemical warfare on insects began at that point. So you have these 4 incredible pillars that defined farming from that point. They call it turbocharged farming. So that switch went on for production, boom, at that point. And the problem is nobody turned that switch off. So then we entered Europe, I think in 1973, when we joined CAP, sort of came into our system, the Common Agricultural Policy. And without boring the details, I mean, these subsidies, which were given to farmers, were done for a reason. They were to feed our nations. The EU was to basically secure food security for Europe. So there was method to all this one-directional target. So CAP was introduced at that point. That's where the subsidies came for our farmers to produce at any cost. And of course, we were ignorant in our knowledge to what we were doing to the environment at those stages. And this continued until we ended up with the food mountains of the 80s, the butter mountains, the flour mountains. That's where Bob Geldof enters and go, bloody hell, we've got starvation in Ethiopia and we've got mountains of food here in Europe. And he tried to shift that balance at that point. And I guess we looked at CAP a little bit more and we decided then, well, rather than pay to produce, let's pay based on land. So they paid on how much land you had. So the rich got richer, the poor got poorer, the shift went again, which brought us to Brexit, which actually you can put Europe on the figure of 8 as a big system, and Britain pulling out is the disturbance to that system. So we pull out of that system, it starts to unravel, but without confusing things. So we pull out of Brexit, and then we're on our own. So we developed a new agricultural bill, which is still up for debate, I guess, but I think it's gone through. And then we developed the environmental plan, the 25-year health and harmony plan. And when I first saw it, I thought, wow, actually, policy's starting to nudge before the science, which normally it lags 10 years behind. And for the first time, I actually looked at this and thought, this makes sense. This really does make sense. So the big strap line to landowners now is that we will no longer be paying you on produce. We will pay you public money for public goods. So we will pay farmers now to produce public goods, clean air, clean water, healthy soil, nutritious food, and high biodiversity. So of course, all the farmers, what the hell? How much are you going to pay me? How much does it cost for clean air? How much? That's where it's all gone nuts. And this is where you hear things like the Dasgupta Review, incredible Indian professor who basically has written a landmark report for the government, which for the first time is called the economics of biodiversity. So this big debate of putting a price on nature. Can we put a price on nature? Is it what we should do? Just to, you see, because nature does all these things at the moment for free, everything. They put just the bee. If we lost the services that the bee currently does for free, they're at £1 billion a year. 1 billion. And China, they've already lost the bee. So yes, they have their paintbrushes and they are pollinating by hand. So it's a real thing, and that's just the bee. If you imagine scaling up or down, the complexity of nature, and how you put a price on that. So
this is where actually Hugh comes in with the rewilding. I'd love to draw you out here a little bit, and you've been obviously catching people's attention with what you're doing with your work with Wild East. And so tell us a little bit about how does rewilding work?
Well, we'll probably start by with how we started, or why we started Wild East. I think we described ourselves, me and my two fellow founders, as recovering degenerative farmers, which we're kind of hearing about here, which is pretty accurate. I mean, I'd spent 10 years at home trying to change and articulate my desire to do better, and absolutely from a non-expert base, I'm the first to admit. And actually, in the journey, in that period, I've found every other incoming generation sort of suffering the same thing, either against a farm manager or a father. And then for all of us, a couple of years ago, having kind of finally got to where we wanted to get to, we kind of also were sort of the realization that unless we all do it, then we're going to fail or continue to fail. Because in a sense, the biodiversity grants through endless different schemes that I've been involved with have failed really because of the lack of joined up. An island of Ireland, as Ben MacDonald best describes it in his book Rebirding. But so Wild East, in a sense, was an attempt. It wasn't really solely about rewilding at all, and we debated hotly the name, but it was really an attempt to kind of rebrand. If anything, it's a brand for other things to get behind for our region, still to be the great farming region we are, but to be more biodiverse, wetter, wilder, woodier, and a cultural change that goes with that. And there's no, as we've heard today, I think maybe one of the things that Elms misses is the link between consumer and farmer. I mean, we're talking only about farmers, and there's a need for that messaging to be much stronger. But in terms of rewilding, I mean, ecosystem services, naturalistic grazing systems. I mean, it's been pulled apart a lot as a phrase. I think to the real, we talked about George Monbiot earlier, but to the real purist, it's abandonment and stripping back man from the kind of landscape, and that's not where I am at. I think it's a kind of naive position to take, or super idealistic at best, but naive really. But really, it's allowing nature to take the lead in nature recovery. That's the key thing. We've kind of gave ourselves the term Homo sapiens, I think, in the mid 19th century, and actually, in this journey, we're realising. So even now, we're realising that actually we're not as wise as we think, and that nature actually has a better cure than we've been able to do in agriculture, through regenerative agriculture, but also in nature restoration. I think in the East Anglian landscape, of course, we're a farming landscape, and no one, and certainly not me, and certainly not Wild East, see large-scale rewilding in this area. I think where it has a place, and using my example at Fritton Lake as an example, we've been, well before Brexit, modelling what the reduction of the direct payments will look like for our farming system, and on our very light land, and we're talking about heathland, former part of the Suffolk Sandlings. It's not farmable without direct subsidy, so it's a kind of pushing in an open door there, and it absolutely suits. And I've got pre-existing tourism, and it is, as I say, an important fragment of sort of Suffolk cultural heritage. But so I think the best way to imagine it in a future landscape, and I think we need to get much better at visualising, imagineering those landscapes. The Dutch have been really good at this for a while, to help ordinary people try and see what the Trumpton chocolate box version of the countryside that we're all used to, trimmed hedges and nice lanes and a patchwork of fields, might look like in 50 years' time. kind of quite different, but it's pockets of rewilding, which sort of supercharge nature recovery. But just as Suffolk Wildlife Trust, Norfolk Wildlife Trust, Essex Wildlife Trust have been doing for some time in their micro reserves, but more of them privately owned, pumping nature out into the surrounding more benign farming landscape. So that's kind of how I see it in East Anglia. It's not in any sense, Wild East is important for the audience to understand who have been picking up. It's not about rewilding per se, but more, if it is, it's about a cultural rewilding rather than the land abandonment.
Interesting. Yes, it's really about a cultural transformation from the consumer's point of view as well as the farmer as well? Or?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think taking what Anna was saying earlier, actually sort of a much better articulation of something that I'd heard on the radio, a more professional articulation. But it is about that. There was a nice thing I was listening to not that long ago about, not relevant to farming, but that at any point in time we live in other men's dreams. And I think we are living at the end of a dream of those people after the war who formed our agricultural system that we've only now realised has been a great success. If you're looking at food, is plentiful and very much cheaper than it was, but at great catastrophic cost really to our human health. I think is important to understand. We've seen that through COVID, particularly in this country, but also our biodiversity, our soil. And also animal welfare. You know, I would describe myself as a welfarian as far as my farming system and meat eating. And I appreciate that's a privileged middle class position to take, but it's absolutely the position we need the nation to take to allow ourselves to farm in a more, in a regenerative way. We need to find a way to eating less meat.
No, absolutely. I think I'd love to bring either John or Anna here in this, in terms of we know that rewilding is largely untested, but from your perspectives, does this approach have potential in restoring our soil and just a pathway towards a more sustainable planet?
Yeah, I think it's really, we've kind of touched on it, but I think it would be good if we expand on this land sharing, land sparing kind of debate. So basically, we've come through the green revolution, where we've achieved massive productivity gains in agriculture, and now we're realizing quite how negative some of the consequences of that were, and we're looking for how to step forward. And there's these two different options, potentially, you could see it like that, of either land sparing, where we carry on intensification, and then kind of George Monbiot's futurism view would be that eventually you just take land use out of agriculture altogether, and you're kind of precision fermenting food in vats, and then you free up as much land as possible to completely rewild, and maybe there's a small bit of land use, really high intensity, so the land footprint is as small as possible, and that's the primary goal. And then the alternative is kind of land sparing, where it's like maybe we need to move back to a slightly more agroecological techniques, where we can have some agricultural land use, but we're recognizing that that isn't natural land, but we can have some balance of outputs across kind of farming, food products, and biodiversity. And I think that this is where the science can say what we could achieve with either option, but it's ultimately not a scientific decision, because it's going to come down to values, and some of those are cultural values that we just cannot give a scientific appraisal of. So from a pure kind of biodiversity perspective, then it probably is better to pursue that high-intensity land-sparing approach, because simply the more land given over exclusively for nature, the better for nature, and most of the measures of that kind of species diversity are going to follow from just having a bigger natural land footprint. But we, in the UK, we have been heavily deforested for millennia. We actually have more forest now than we had 100 years ago. And we quite like having an agricultural landscape, as we've kind of discussed today. I drove down from Norfolk today, and I drove through down from Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex countryside, and I was thinking it's quite nice. I wasn't seeing every field, every agricultural mosaic as a kind of missed opportunity for nature and carbon sequestration. So we do need some of that. We do need to rewild. But I think if we're going to move forward, we have to have this conversation and recognize that this is going to come down to our choice and our values. And so I think that pushing too hard on the land sparing side just isn't going to work, even if you have the perspective that wild nature and wild land use is its own thing to achieve in its own right. And so you're always going to pursue that just for the sake of wildness, even apart from any kind of metrics of how many species are there. I think even if you see it that way, if you want to achieve it, then you need to bring in a broader political group and have buy-in from the landowners, or it's not going to happen anyway. But I also want to add a slightly cautionary note on land sparing as well. And I think that we're also in danger of overselling what land sharing can do, So people like Alan Savory, they're doing good research talking about, if we have a complex grazing system with soil regeneration, that can achieve a lot. And it can. We're taking quite heavily degraded soils, and if we reintroduce long-term rotations with a grazing step in that, we can build up the soil organic matter. That will be carbon that was in the atmosphere in the soil. But just like I was saying with the forests earlier, that soil is going to cap out at a certain amount of soil organic carbon. So it's not going to fix climate change to have the whole world as a cattle ranch. And if we're thinking about, I think as the vibe I'm getting from most of us as how we're trying to be ethical carnivores, is that we're comfortable eating meat if we know how it's produced and if it's done kind of in the right way with a balance of respect for nature and trying to join in the ecological systems. But if we want all meat to be produced like that, then we're going to simply have to accept there will be much less meat overall. And somewhere like the UK, and especially somewhere like the USA, to produce meat only in that sustainable manner isn't going to provide enough meat to feed a world of 9 billion people consuming at the rates that we do right now. So I lean a bit more, despite being an ecologist, I do lean a bit more towards the land sharing idea. I think it's just more workable in practice, but it's not going to be a get out of jail free card just to essentially carry on our current consumption habits.
Yeah, exactly, makes sense. So it's really meat reduction rather than meat abstinence.
It's going to have to be part of the story. We can talk about how we want to do agriculture better, but ultimately we're going to need to feed people, and as consumers, we have a part in driving that agricultural transformation. So cows, they do sequester carbon, but it's not as simple as they are the solution to climate change either. It's not, but we want to manage the soil better, and that will have a soil carbon sequestering role, but they're still going to be burping out the methane. So they're never going to be completely free from the climate. I guess just to get back to some of the stuff I was saying earlier, to stabilize temperature at any level, hopefully 1.5 to 2 degrees, we need to get to net zero carbon dioxide, no way around that. And we need to, at the very least, stop methane emissions increasing, but they are still increasing at the moment. And then probably we're not going to be able to decarbonize anytime soon enough to stay under 2 degrees. So we're going to have to reforest, have bioenergy and carbon capture to start taking carbon back out and reduce agricultural emissions below their current levels. We're going to have to do all of those things to have even a chance of meeting our temperature targets, which we're almost certainly not going to meet anyway. So we can't just let cows off the hook. We do need we need to change agriculture and change our consumption patterns.
Perceptions.
But I think there is a sustainable space for some level of livestock production.
It's quantity, isn't it? So we're getting close to, I want to give you some time for the audience to ask some questions, but I have one more question as we're talking about this, which is, okay, we're saying less meat, but then what are we replacing it with? So plant-based alternatives, we were talking earlier, fake meats, lab-grown meats. Can you tell us a bit more about the kind of carbon footprint of those, and what are the implications to our system around the alternatives?
Before we even get into the comparisons, most people in the UK don't need to replace that meat with anything. We have more than enough energy intake, more than enough protein intake. I'm sure that most people in the audience, like myself, could probably think about what we eat and realize we could probably just cut some of it out, no problem. If we need a really substantial change that is going to possibly reduce our overall protein intake, then the plant-based substitutes are generally going to be more efficient, just for the reasons I said earlier. You're growing the crop and then consuming it directly without that wasteful animal stage in the middle. There's going to be land use arguments about some areas that are best used for livestock, or if they're part of a rotation. So again, I think there is a space for livestock there. But in general, the plant-based substitutes are going to be more efficient. Lab-grown meat and things like that, it's very early days. We've done some work on this, and we basically don't really know if it's going to be better for the climate or not. because it's all being done in small-scale experimental systems, and the companies are telling us it's going to be better for the environment, but until we have some real data of real at-scale production going out to consumers, we just can't assess that.
And what energy are they using
Exactly,
to make
yeah.
that?
The worry at the moment is you're essentially replacing cows burping out methane with a potentially high
Fossil
energy
fuel.
demand. And while our energy system is from fossil fuels, that's probably actually quite a bad trade-off to make in the long term. If it is efficient and if we do decarbonize, then it might be time to revisit that conversation, and then it'll be more, how can we fit livestock in a more agroecological system versus replacing some of it with cultured meat. The final point on cultured meat is that if we don't even want to eat it, then it's not going to replace anything. If we're going to have this new product where people would rather just eat livestock anyway, then it's not going to have the positives, even if it is more sustainable to produce.
Yeah.
So I think it's very early to hold it up as the savior of the food system.
Indeed, yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, I want to give enough time for questions. I want to just thank our amazing panel for their time today. But let's open up to the questions, and I'll take them in batches of 3 if there are. We've got one at the back there.
Shall I start?
Yes, go for it.
Given the alarming acceleration that we see on a daily basis of everything going much quicker than we ever thought it was going to go, and this seems to be a consistent theme now, and the difficulty of persuading people to give up incredibly complex economic situations which are involved with large-scale farming, etc., etc. So these things about, and when you say that you can't force people or tell them what to eat, do you anticipate a point when you might have to, as in more draconian measures? In other words, if we're completely fucked at a certain point, and like a war, you kind of go, well, are we smart enough to fix this, but would it take something slightly fascistic to do that? Would you anticipate a moment like that coming fairly soon?
We'll take other question over there. We're going to take them in batches, and then we'll answer them, and you can decide who wants to take that one.
Thank you. I love the idea of these targets to maintain the temperature, but and we've got to lead by example, but we are a tiny part of the landmass, and unless we get China, Russia, America to start doing the same, it's going to be too late. We're going to sail over the cliff. And how can we get them on board? Because they're not listening, and the volume of fossil fuel power stations that are being created in China, I think it's 1 a week, and we haven't got a chance unless we look at this globally. It's a great idea, but we've got to get them on board.
Yeah, very good point. And then we'll take the third at the back there.
We had a life-changing experience in Hong Kong 2 years ago by having an incredible burger at the airport, which was indistinguishable from the real thing. I wonder what the panel thinks about the possibility of scaling up that product.
Okay.
I'd like,
Do you want to?
do you mean an impossible burger? Yeah. I read a statistic, like in America now, 10% of the burgers sold in Burger King are impossible burgers. So that's taking out a lot of, that's a plant-based, it's not lab-grown. And I am presuming, I'm being told that it is much lower carbon footprint. So that's got to be a good thing, right? And then to answer, like, the other 2 points are just 2 small things, like people have repeatedly said, right, we need a meat tax, and they do little survey groups, and the British public won't have it, and so no politician, we might be in a lot of trouble, but meat taxes, which is a way of forcing people to eat less meat, just politicians don't want to do it because the public will riot. You know, you've seen like front pages of the Sun, you know, the great British, what did Boris say recently? No one's going to be taking away our great British banger. Mm-hmm. So people are quite culturally attached to it. So I think there are probably cleverer nudge ways you could do it, like replacing food in hospitals and prisons with less meat, that sort of thing. And I think that young people are leading it and eating less meat. And just on China, I don't know if any of the rest of the panel know it, but I don't know the Chinese have a target on eating less meat. So we kind of underestimate China. They're actually ahead of us on some of these things.
Actually, yes. China's interesting because Britain is 60% food secure, which is quite unnerving, seeing as we've pulled out of all these systems. The one thing that we do actually protects the nation is food security. So China, within 5 years, achieved 98% food security, which was quite astonishing. So we asked, how do they do it? And they capped, as John was talking about, they capped everything. No further fertilizer use, no further water use. And they drove it. They drove it through the nation. So it's kind of like they are almost a self-regulating system. So it's interesting. I mean, it's to me, and to answer perhaps everybody's question, I think, I remember 15 years ago being in a master's class where we were talking about systems, and I said, well, it's quite simple. You just take GDP, which to me is the problem globally. GDP is kind of like the worst dinner guest you could ever hope to imagine at your table. This was written on the back of a fag packet. This is the one thing that sold out the value over cost. And this is the price we're paying. So I remember just saying, well, it's easy. You change gross domestic product, which is basically what we use now to exchange trade, and you replace it with gross natural product. So surely if you've got a high GDP, you must have raped your country of resource. So why not just change it to gross natural product? And he laughed at me. You're joking. You're thinking about changing a global economic health index? Yeah, because it's unhealthy. So if you have a high gross natural product, that would mean that you would have somehow as a country protected your resources. And therefore I would want to trade with them. And that was 15 years ago when I was laughed at. And then I think it was a couple of months ago, it was headline BBC News. And that is what we're trying to do. That is the Disruptor report. To change the way we trade would fundamentally change everything. But again, these are a lot of countries have. Scandinavia are moving towards circular economies. It's changing this one word. I say this to farmers. If you can't think of any new approach, just change one word. The word is you take maximization out, because everything is about maximization. Maximize yield, maximize fields, maximize profit, margins, blah, blah, blah. Everything's maximized. But if you take that one out and replace it with optimized, optimize your systems, you get a completely different approach. I mean, so you then, it's about securing what you have. You optimize the system. It becomes more efficient. You use what you have better. And I think if we have a word that can align to us better today, because the maximization is a bit linear 80s, and it takes you to hell. It works for a certain amount of time, and then something comes from left field. They call it the black swan in big economic systems thinking, a very famous book in economics. Black swans are unknown events that come from left field that no one can predict. And of course, I quickly looked up, is COVID a black swan? No, it absolutely was not. It was a white swan, known, predicted, and a symptom of climate change. So if we were more resilient, perhaps things like COVID should not hit us like it did.
I just want to jump back on the point about the UK's climate priorities in an international context is very interesting there. So right back at the start, we were saying we always hear these figures about what percentage of global warming is from agriculture versus transport, whatever. I think whenever you read them, try and take note of what scale they're talking about, because normally they're global, and in the UK, those figures don't really apply. So the UK actually per capita has the biggest impact on temperature change per person, and that's not because of our agriculture, that's because we led the Industrial Revolution, and as I was saying, we've got 150 plus years of CO2 emissions that we emitted still contributing to warming the planet. So if we're looking from a UK perspective, what's our climate responsibility? It's even more strongly from fossil fuels than agriculture than the rest of the world. So from that perspective, I think really the UK should be trying to recapture that fossil carbon to show we're doing our bit, rather than overemphasizing the role of agriculture. But having said that, I think in terms of showing that it is plausible to redesign agricultural policy and change consumption patterns, that will be a very valuable role for the UK if we can do that. But again, we absolutely shouldn't let that forget about our fossil sins.
Thank you so much for all your great questions, and thank you to our amazing panel for such an enlightening and informative discussion. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Thank you so much.